Hey everyone, welcome back to Dark Whispers, where we uncover the buried horrors of America's darkest past. Today's story takes us deep into the heart of Mississippi, 1836, a year drenched in fear, mystery, and unexplainable death. It's the tale of two enslaved sisters, known only by whispers as the Slave Sisters of Death. 42 lives were lost in a single year, all tied to their names. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell, because bringing these true hidden stories to light takes a lot of research, sleepless nights, and real historical digging. The story of the Slave Sisters begins on the outskirts of Natchez, Mississippi, in the early spring of 1836. The sisters, identified in sparse plantation records as Clara and Lucille, were purchased together at a New Orleans auction by a wealthy planter named Thomas Caldwell, known for his brutal treatment of enslaved people. They were said to be inseparable, rarely speaking, always watching, and always working side by side. From the moment they arrived, the Caldwell plantation seemed to shift in tone. Animals grew restless, workers whispered of strange noises from the slave quarters at night, and even Caldwell's overseer described the sisters as unnerving, quiet, and cold as river stones. No one knew where they came from originally. Some said Georgia, others believed they were brought directly from the Caribbean. But their dialect, mannerisms, and certain markings on their arms suggested they carried traditions from the West, African regions still deeply tied to ancestral and spiritual practices. Despite their silence, they seemed to communicate with one another through glances and gestures that others could not interpret. Within days, the plantation's atmosphere became heavy, and a sense of dread began to spread among the enslaved workers. Thomas Caldwell, ever the skeptic, dismissed the fear as superstition, but his wife, Margaret Caldwell, grew uneasy, claiming that every time the sisters crossed her path, she felt a chill that lingered. Some nights she claimed to hear chanting carried by the wind from the quarters where Clara and Lucille slept. By the end of that first month, 2 field workers had fallen mysteriously ill and died within days of each other, marking the first of what would become 42 unexplained deaths over the next year. What began as whispers of bad luck slowly transformed into something darker. The enslaved community began calling them the Death Sisters, believing they could call upon unseen forces. And though their story was buried under layers of plantation secrecy, it was this chilling beginning that set the stage for one of the most terrifying legends in Mississippi's history. The first death came quietly, almost unnoticed. A field hand named Jonah collapsed mid-harvest, his body cold and rigid despite the scorching Mississippi heat. The overseer called it exhaustion, but within a week another worker, a young woman, named Mabel, was found lifeless in her bed, eyes wide open as if frozen in terror. These weren't isolated incidents. By the end of the season, 10 more had died, each with no visible wounds, no signs of struggle, and no clear cause. What unsettled everyone most was the pattern. Each death happened within days of an encounter with Clara or Lucille. Sometimes they had simply passed by the victim in the fields. Other times, the person had been overheard speaking ill of the sisters the night before. Whispers began to ripple through the quarters. "If they look at you too long, you'll be gone by morning." Thomas Caldwell refused to believe any of it. To him, these were coincidences, the result of disease or heat stroke. But his wife Margaret started keeping notes, recording every name, every date, every strange occurrence. Her journal, later, found scorched but partially intact after the plantation burned, described a curse walking among us, two shadows in the shape of women. The sisters themselves never protested or spoke about the rumors. They worked silently, never showing fear or fatigue, even when others began avoiding them entirely. One worker claimed to have seen Lucille burying small handmade dolls wrapped in cloth near the edge of the field, each one marked with something that looked like a name, scratched into the dirt. Another swore he saw Clara whispering over a dead crow while drawing strange symbols with ash on the ground. As more deaths followed, even the overseer, once a loud skeptic, refused to go near their cabin after sunset. The air around the plantation grew thick with dread, as though something unseen was feeding on the fear itself. By the end of that terrible year, 42 lives had been taken, and there was no logical explanation left standing. Whatever was happening, it seemed bound to the sisters, two women trapped in a world of cruelty, wielding a power no one dared to understand. As the deaths mounted, so too did the rumors, each one darker than the last. By late 1836, the Caldwell plantation was no longer just a place of labor. It had become a place of fear. The enslaved workers began to refuse the night shifts, terrified of the eerie chanting that drifted from the sisters' cabin after midnight. Some swore they saw flickering blue flames near the old cypress grove. Others claimed to hear voices speaking in a language no one could understand. Whatever it was, it didn't sound human. It was around this time that locals outside the plantation began to take notice. Traders passing through spoke of two cursed women whose gaze could make a man fall sick. In the nearby town of Natchez, whispers grew that the Caldwell plantation was haunted, that the soil itself had turned against the living. The enslaved community began calling Clara and Lucille the Sisters of Death, a name that carried both terror and a strange reverence. Margaret Caldwell's journal recorded one chilling event that cemented their reputation. One evening, after a violent storm, a lightning strike hit the large oak behind the slave quarters. When morning came, the tree stood split down the middle, its bark blackened. Around its base were symbols carved into the roots, circles within circles, marked with something like bone dust. The sisters were seen nearby, staring silently as if the destruction had been expected. From that day forward, the plantation dogs refused to go near their cabin. Birds stopped nesting in the nearby trees, and one overseer claimed he saw Clara standing barefoot in the field one night, her hands raised toward the sky, whispering as if commanding the wind. Hours later, the man fell ill with a fever so intense that he raved about black eyes in the dark before dying the next morning. Though the other enslaved workers feared them deeply, some began to see the sisters as something more than human, a force of vengeance sent to punish those who inflicted pain. They whispered that the sisters had made a pact with ancient spirits, calling upon the old gods of their ancestors to strike down cruelty with death. Whether this was superstition or survival myth, one thing was certain. Wherever Clara and Lucille went, death followed, silent and unrelenting. Even the most powerful men in the region began avoiding the Caldwell estate. Fields went untended, and the once profitable plantation was slowly rotting from within. But for the sisters, nothing seemed to change. They continued their work, their faces calm, their voices rarely heard, as if they already knew how this story would end. By early 1837, fear on the Caldwell plantation had reached its breaking point. The pattern of death had become impossible to ignore, and the air was thick with both dread and superstition. With every new grave dug in the workers' burial field, the whispers grew louder. People saying the sisters had called something into the world that could no longer be controlled. But for the first time, outsiders took an interest. Local authorities and church ministers arrived, desperate to make sense of the chaos that had swallowed the Caldwell estate. The investigation began quietly, with the county sheriff and Reverend Amos Breyer sent to question the enslaved workers. Most refused to speak at all. Those who did only repeated the same trembling warnings: they see death before it comes. When asked who they were, every voice whispered the same answer: the sisters. The Reverend, convinced that the devil himself had taken root on the plantation, insisted on searching their quarters. What they found inside chilled even the hardened sheriff. The walls were covered in strange drawings made of ash and blood, depicting spirals, hands, and what appeared to be human eyes. In the corner sat a small wooden box filled with bones, some animal, some unmistakably human. Beneath it, buried in the dirt floor, were 7 small cloth dolls, each tied with a lock of real hair. The sheriff ordered them burned immediately, but the Reverend hesitated, claiming that destroying such things could unleash what's bound within. Meanwhile, Margaret Caldwell, pale and gaunt from sleepless nights, presented her journal as evidence. Her writings described in detail how each death coincided with the sisters' strange rituals: the chanting, the markings in the soil, and their habit of wandering the fields just before dawn. But the most disturbing entry spoke of her husband, Thomas Caldwell. In it, she wrote that he had fallen ill after striking one of the sisters during an outburst, saying, "She looked at him once, only once, and that was enough." Within 3 days, he was dead. His skin had turned ashen, and his eyes appeared clouded, like someone who had drowned without water. The plantation was now under watch. Guards were placed around the sisters' cabin, but strange things continued to happen. Horses refused to enter the barn. The guards complained of whispers in the night and sudden gusts of cold air. One man claimed to see footprints appear in the mud, with no one walking there. Fear spread faster than reason, and soon the sheriff himself ordered the sisters restrained, accusing them of witchcraft and murder. But before any formal charge could be made, tragedy struck again. The overseer who had handled the evidence, those dolls and symbols, was found dead at sunrise, his body twisted in unnatural angles. The sheriff fled the property that same day, declaring that no law of man could fix what lived there. In the weeks that followed, the plantation was abandoned by most of its workers. Crops rotted in the field, the house began to decay, and the legend of the slave sisters of death solidified into something no investigation could ever undo. What had started as an inquiry into mysterious deaths ended as a story whispered across Mississippi, a haunting reminder that even in a land ruled by cruelty, some powers refused to bow to man. The final night came in the summer of 1837, a night that Mississippi would remember for generations. The air was heavy and electric, as if the land itself sensed what was coming. The Caldwell plantation, once a thriving monument to wealth, now stood in eerie silence, its fields untended, its workers gone or dead, and the main house dimly lit by trembling candlelight. Inside, Margaret Caldwell sat alone, clutching her journal, certain that something terrible was about to happen. She later wrote in what would be her final entry, "The sisters have stopped working. The air hums with death." Just before midnight, witnesses from nearby farms claimed to see a pillar of smoke rising from the direction of the plantation. The sky glowed red as if the earth itself had caught fire. When the sheriff and a group of men arrived hours later, they found the Caldwell mansion engulfed in flames. The roof had collapsed, and the slave quarters were already reduced to ash. But the most horrifying discovery lay in what remained of the sisters' cabin. Inside the burned structure, their chains were still fastened, yet there were no bodies. Only the faint outline of two figures could be seen scorched into the floorboards, like shadows burned into wood. Around those marks were the same symbols found before: spirals, hands, eyes, drawn in soot and something darker. Some said the fire started from within their cabin. Others believed lightning struck the property again, just as it had months before. But what no one could explain was why the flames stopped abruptly at the boundary of the plantation, as though some unseen barrier refused to let the fire spread beyond that cursed soil. The sheriff and Reverend Breyer tried to piece together what happened, but every account contradicted the next. A few surviving workers claimed they saw the sisters standing in the field as the fire raged, their faces calm, their hands clasped together, as if in prayer. One man swore they walked straight into the blaze without screaming. Another said they disappeared into a whirlwind of black smoke, leaving only silence behind. When the fire finally died, the plantation was gone. The Caldwell family perished inside the house. Margaret's journal found beside her charred remains, her last line reading, "They have come for us all." No trace of Clara or Lucille was ever found. The official report listed the cause as an accident, but those who had been there knew better. The land was sold, but every new owner abandoned it within months, claiming to hear weeping voices and footsteps in the fields after midnight. Over time, locals began to call it the Death Ground, a cursed stretch of Mississippi earth where nothing would grow. Even today, long after the last ruins vanished, people say that on stormy nights you can still see two figures walking through the mist, moving hand in hand, silent and watchful. Some say they were avengers, others believe they were damned. But everyone agrees on one thing: the Caldwell plantation died with them, and the slave sisters of death never truly left.